Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a scenario, a nation, right? One that, hoards itself up as a democracy, a thriving one even. But then it starts kind of systematically muzzling voices. And I don't just mean political disagreement.
No, it goes deeper.
Exactly. Picture digital profiles just vanishing. Poof. Gone without a trace. Major media companies finding themselves stuck in these relentless, open-ended investigations.
Investigations that never seem to conclude.
Right. And even comedians, people whose whole job is pushing boundaries, they suddenly get caught in the crosshairs. Invisible crosshairs almost, of a system that's supposed to be protecting them.
Yeah.
Now, the immediate thought might be, okay, this sounds like some far-off, obviously authoritarian place.
That's the typical picture, isn't it?
But hold that thought, because we're not talking about that.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest this reality. It's unfolding in Brazil. Right now, basically, in 2025.
And what's really fascinating there, or maybe unsettling is a better word, is the stark contrast. The contrast this presents to how we usually think about a democratic nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
We tend to link those kinds of actions, erasing digital lives, targeting media, that chilling effect on just speaking your mind. We link those with regimes that don't even pretend to be democratic.
Right. Openly authoritarian states.
Exactly. But here, the situation our sources describe, it points to this, deeply worrying reality where the actual foundations of free expression seem to be under enormous stress. And maybe not despite democratic processes, but perhaps even using them or under the guise of them.
Using the system against itself almost.
It really challenges how we understand democratic erosion,
in
the 21st century. It's often not a big dramatic coup anymore.
No tanks in the streets.
Right. It's more subtle, legalistic sometimes, but ultimately really pervasive forms of control.
Absolutely. And when you hear about opposition figures being effectively exiled, like pushed out of the country, or elected parliamentarians facing severe censorship, not being able to speak freely, and then digital influencers, people with huge followings, seeing their bank accounts frozen or their whole online platform, their livelihood, just erased by a court order.
Let's trash this.
Makes you ask the fundamental question, what is actually left of freedom of expression in that environment?
Exactly.
So this deep dive, that's what it's all about. We're trying to pull back the curtain on what our sources are telling us is really happening in Brazil. And they paint this honestly chilling picture. A nation where it seems increasingly just disagreeing with the official narrative or maybe questioning certain powerful institutions.
Especially the judiciary, it seems.
Right. That can lead to, the destruction of your digital life, your ability to earn a living, and sometimes, like you said, even your physical freedom, arrest, or the threat of it.
And our mission here in this deep dive is precisely that. To take all this information we've gathered, and it's a lot, from detailed articles, research, legal analyses, even first-hand accounts.
Yeah, it's comprehensive.
And distill it down. Extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, let's say. We want to give you, the listener, a kind of shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on this critical and frankly, alarming subject.
It's complex stuff.
It is. So we're going to peel back the layers, look at the underlying political context, the social tensions that led here. Then we'll highlight specific, concrete cases, real people, real consequences to make these abstract ideas tangible.
Bringing it down to earth.
Exactly. We'll analyze the very specific tactics the sources say are being used, and then zoom out again to discuss the bigger implications. For Brazil itself, it's democracy, but also for the rest of the world watching.
Right, the international angle.
It's a complicated tapestry, really. Law, politics, technology, all woven together. We're going to try and untangle it for you, show the patterns and the profound consequences.
So here's where it gets really interesting right from the get-go. This isn't just like normal political back and forth, is it?
Not according to the sources, no.
They indicate Brazil's been going through this process of intense, almost visceral political polarization for a while now, since at least 2019.
Yeah, that date comes up a lot.
And it's not just, disagreeing on policy. It's described as a rapid slide into this deep ideological chasm, like a Grand Canyon-sized rift in society.
That's a good way to put it.
The country apparently became more and more divided into these two sort of irreconcilable camps, radically opposed blocs.
Almost like two different countries living side by side.
Yeah. And this deep societal split, often amplified by social media and, digital narratives, that's the really turbulent backdrop for everything else that follows.
You have to understand that level of animosity, that deep-seated division, to really grasp why things might have escalated the way they did.
It sets the stage.
Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a political landscape that was already, highly charged, volatile, even before these latest developments we're focusing on.
It didn't come out of nowhere.
Not at all. The election of Jair Bolsonaro back in 2018 that really brought these ideological divides right to the surface, made them starker, more entrenched, weaponized even.
Yeah, weaponized feels right.
The political spectrum wasn't just broad. It felt like it shattered into these two increasingly radicalized camps. And each side viewed the other with, deep suspicion, maybe even outright hostility, like the other side was an existential threat.
Wow.
So this intense polarization, it created fertile ground for the kind of tensions, the accusations flying back and forth about fake news, and ultimately for the restrictions on speech that we're seeing described now.
It became more than just politics.
It really did. It felt more like a cultural war. And that unfortunately set the stage for the kind of judicial interventions that our sources focus on.
Okay. And then came the election in 2022, a really pivotal moment.
Huge.
Bolsonaro lost his re-election bid. His rival, Lula da Silva, won. Now, our sources stress this wasn't just a standard handover of power, the usual democratic process.
No, it marked a major shift.
They highlight it as a really significant turning point, especially in the dynamics of power within the country, like the balance between the president and, crucially, the courts.
The judiciary.
And what's emphasized, what they point to directly, is that since that election result, voices associated with the political right, the ones who are maybe more prominent under Bolsonaro,
or critical of the new government and the courts.
Exactly. Those voices started facing increasingly severe restrictions, escalating restrictions. It's presented almost as a direct cause and effect.
A clear correlation in timing.
Yeah. Marking this profound shift in how political talk is managed, or maybe, as the sources suggest, how it's suppressed. Especially for anyone opposing the new establishment.
And this leads us right to a really critical development, one that seems to underpin so much of what we're talking about today.
The courts.
Yes. The increasingly active, and some sources would definitely say interventionist, political role of the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, as it's known in Brazil. Our sources really pinpoint the STF as a key driver, maybe the key driver of these big changes we're seeing in freedom of expression and due process.
How so? What specifically?
Well, specifically, they highlight the court initiating several very broad, sometimes vaguely defined investigative inquiries. Inquiritos, they're called.
Inquiries into what?
Things like, famously, the fake news inquiry. There's also one on digital militias, another on anti-democratic acts.
Those sound quite broad. Anti-democratic acts. What does that even cover?
That's part of the issue raised. The scope is vast and potentially subjective. But here's the crucial thing. These weren't mostly investigations started by the public prosecutor, which is the normal way things work in Brazil.
Right. The prosecutors usually investigate.
Correct. But in many key instances, these inquiries were self-initiated by the STF itself. The court decided to investigate.
The court starting its own investigation.
Yes. And that unique structure, combined with the really wide scope investigating fuzzy concepts like fake news, it effectively gave the judiciary powers that normally belong to prosecutors, even the police.
Blurring the lines.
Massively blurring the lines of oversight and accountability. Our sources argue this concentration of power, where the court effectively acts as investigator, accuser, and judge.
All in one.
All in one. It fundamentally changes the balance of powers within the state, and it seems to be the central mechanism behind what the sources describe as judicial overreach.
That is a crucial distinction, the court initiating and running its own investigations. It really does sound like a departure from the traditional role of a judge.
It's presented as highly unusual, yes.
So, okay, we have this backdrop. Intense polarization, a shift in power after the election, and this increasingly active Supreme Court launching its own wide-ranging investigations.
That sets the stage, yeah.
So the natural next question is, who? Who exactly is getting caught up in all this? Because, legal frameworks are one thing, but the real story, the nuggets of knowledge we want to get at, is about the impact on individuals.
Human cost.
Exactly. Let's peel back another layer. Let's look at the actual people whose stories, according to our sources, really embody this trend. First up, Deputy Daniel Silveira, an elected official.
Yes, a sitting member of Congress at the time.
And he was arrested. Our sources say not for corruption or a common crime, but specifically because of statements he made. Statements considered offensive to the STF itself.
Offensive to the court.
Which immediately makes you think, well, where's the line between protecting the court's dignity and protecting an elected official's right to speak freely, even critically?
It's a very fine line, and his case pushed right up against it, or arguably crossed it. The Silveira case is particularly illustrative, actually, because it led to this direct, pretty much unprecedented constitutional clash.
A clash between who?
Between the judiciary, the STF, and the executive branch, the president. Because our sources highlight this really significant fact.
Yeah.
Then President Bolsonaro issued a presidential pardon for Silveira.
Okay, a pardon. That's a standard presidential power, right?
It is. It's a check on judicial power found in many democracies. A way for the executive to mitigate a court sentence. Usually that's the final word.
And not this time.
Not this time. In an extraordinary move, one that really sent shockwaves through Brazil's legal and political worlds, the STF chose to disregard it.
They ignored a presidential pardon.
That's what the sources state. They refused to acknowledge it as legitimate in this context. And that act, it escalated things way beyond a simple legal dispute. It became a profound constitutional crisis.
Wow.
It really demonstrated the STF's assertive stance, its willingness to sort of push the boundaries of its own power, effectively nullifying an act of the executive.
What happened to Silveira in the end?
He was ultimately convicted by the STF, lost his mandate as a deputy, and faced imprisonment. It serves as a really powerful, visible example of the court's reach and its willingness to confront even other branches of government.
Okay, that's a stark example. And then there's the journalist, Allan dos Santos. His situation sounds different, but equally concerning.
Yes, his case highlights another dimension of this. Our sources describe his current status as effectively being in exile, living in the United States.
Not by choice.
Not by choice. He's there specifically because there's an active extradition order against him, issued by the Brazilian Supreme Court.
An extradition order for a journalist.
Yes. And crucially, back in Brazil, all his media channels, his websites, his popular social media accounts on platforms like YouTube, Twitter, they've been completely blocked, demonetized, erased from the internet within Brazil by court order.
So he can't communicate with his audience in Brazil?
Effectively, no. It's not just about a political disagreement ending up in court. It's a situation where a journalist's entire livelihood, his platform, his ability to report and comment has been systematically dismantled by judicial action.
Forcing him to live abroad to avoid arrest.
Precisely. Our sources really highlight his case as an example of the judiciary's actions extending even beyond Brazil's borders to silence voices perceived as critical or problematic.
It seems like the tactics are quite varied then. Arrest, exile, what else?
Well, what's fascinating here, or disturbing, is the sheer scope of actions taken against individuals. It's not always about jail time or traditional legal penalties. Sometimes it's about dismantling someone's public presence and their financial stability.
How so?
Take Monark, for example. He's a really well-known commentator, podcaster, huge following.
Right, I've heard the name.
Our sources explained that he basically lost everything professionally. Contracts canceled, his massively popular YouTube channel, the Flow podcast, taken down, his income streams cut off.
Why? What did he do?
It followed a highly controversial opinion he expressed. It was about the freedom of political parties to exist, even ones with, abhorrent ideologies like Nazism. It sparked huge outrage, understandably.
Okay, very controversial.
Extremely. But the response wasn't just public condemnation. Our sources point to the subsequent actions, the deplatforming, the financial ruin. It illustrates the severe economic and professional consequences that can be unleashed.
For expressing an opinion, however offensive it might be to many.
Exactly. It shows how expressing views deemed unacceptable by the system, or perhaps by powerful actors within it, can lead to this kind of total cancellation.
Making it impossible to work, to earn a living, to even have a public voice.
Precisely. It's an incredibly effective way to silence someone without necessarily locking them up. It creates this massive chilling effect on others, too, if it happened to him.
It could happen to me.
Exactly. This digital and economic destruction, our sources argue, is almost like a new form of soft censorship, very 21st century.
So, what does this all mean? Listening to these examples, Silveira, dos Santos, Monark, it's clearly not just a couple of isolated incidents hitting only high-profile political figures, right?
No, definitely not. That's a key takeaway from the sources.
We seem to be seeing a pattern here. And it affects a much wider range of public figures. It goes way beyond traditional politicians or mainstream journalists.
That's right. Our sources group together quite a few names. People like Bruno Ayoub, who is Monark, who we just discussed. Paulo Figueiredo, another commentator. Barbara, from a channel called Teatralize. Gustavo Geyer, who's also a politician, but known for his online presence. Many others, too.
So a mix of people. Commentators, influencers.
Exactly. These aren't all people working for established newspapers or TV stations. They're often independent voices, comedians, digital influencers with huge audiences, people who engage directly with the public, often primarily through social media.
And the actions against them, are they similar?
The actions vary, but the sources describe them as consistently severe. Things like suspended YouTube channels, social media accounts blocked outright within Brazil, bank accounts frozen, making it impossible to access funds.
Frozen bank accounts, just like that.
Apparently based on judicial orders within these broad inquiries. And then there are ongoing administrative and judicial processes, investigations that just seem to drag on forever, keeping people in a state of uncertainty.
It sounds like a very broad net being cast.
It does. It seems to demonstrate a wide-ranging effort that impacts the very fabric of online public discussion, going far beyond what you might think of as traditional political opposition.
Okay, so it hits individuals, influencers. What about larger media organizations? Are established outlets facing pressure too?
Yes, and this raises a really important question, doesn't it? When established, well-known media outlets become targets, what does that signal about the overall health of independent journalism? The environment for just getting information out there.
Especially in a country that calls itself a democracy.
Precisely. Our sources specifically mention channels like Jovem and Terça Livre as being significant targets in this wave of restrictions.
I know Jovem. That's a big network, right? Radio, TV.
Exactly. Historically significant national reach, not some small fringe operation. Terça Livre was also a prominent online news platform, particularly popular on the right.
And what happened to them?
They've faced serious sanctions, according to the sources. Things like having their social media channels blocked or suspended, being demonetized by platforms like YouTube, often following judicial requests, and they're subject to ongoing investigations as well.
So investigations hanging over major news providers.
Yes. And the targeting of such established, widely consumed outlets, our sources argue, suggests a more systematic effort, an effort perhaps to control the national narrative, or at least to suppress information and viewpoints that stray too far from an official or institutionally approved line.
It fundamentally changes the media landscape.
Absolutely. It deeply impacts how information is disseminated, and maybe more importantly, it affects the public's ability to access a wide range of viewpoints. That kind of plurality is essential for any healthy democracy. If that erodes.
It's a serious problem. Okay, let's unpack this next point then, because it really gets to the heart of how all this is happening, or at least how it's being justified.
The mechanism behind it all.
Right. Our sources describe this pervasive tactic where all this censorship, these restrictions, they're being justified by the authorities as necessary to combat disinformation.
The fake news narrative.
Exactly. Which, on the surface sounds almost reasonable, noble even. In this age of information overload, social media chaos.
Everyone's worried about disinformation. It's a global issue.
Right. So the official line, as presented in the sources, is, we're doing this to protect democracy, to protect the public from the harm caused by fake news and malicious disinformation campaigns.
A seemingly legitimate goal, even a necessary one, some would argue, in today's world. But the alleged reality, as our sources portray it, contrasts very sharply with that stated benevolent purpose.
How so?
They describe the actual practice not as some careful, nuanced effort to just correct falsehoods, but as a systematic, sometimes aggressive campaign to achieve something very different. Which is, according to these sources, silencing critics, particularly critics of the government, and maybe even more so, critics of the judiciary itself. Also, impeding independent journalism, especially investigations that might dig up uncomfortable truths. And generally intimidating anyone, opposition politicians, activists, commentators, who holds dissenting views.
So the official story is fighting fake news to save democracy.
While the reality on the ground, according to the sources, looks more like suppressing dissent to consolidate power.
That's a huge disconnect.
A massive disconnect. It suggests a dangerous gap between the stated intention and the perceived actual outcome. And this gap creates a deep, chilling effect on anyone thinking of speaking out.
That disconnect really is key. And when you look at the specific methods being used, the how, it becomes even clearer how this perceived suppression is actually carried out.
Yeah, the mechanics of it.
Our sources detail the widespread, and they say often indiscriminate, use of these individual judicial decisions. Monocraticas, you called them.
Yes, decisions monocraticas. Decisions made by a single judge.
Right, not the full court. And these single judge decisions are used to censor social media accounts, take down online content.
Often very quickly, with immediate effect.
And frequently, the sources stress without the affected person or organization even getting a chance to argue their case beforehand. Is that right?
That's a major point of criticism highlighted in the sources, yes. The lack of prior notification or opportunity to defend oneself before the censorship takes effect.
Which points to this other critical issue emphasized again and again, the profound absence of due process in many of these actions.
A cornerstone of any fair legal system.
Exactly. Due process is fundamental. It ensures fairness, transparency, protects people against arbitrary government power. If that's consistently missing,
it's not just a procedural hiccup. It's a fundamental problem that undermines the legitimacy of the whole process, according to these critiques.
It really challenges the idea of rule of law.
Absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here, in a quite alarming way, is this concentration of power and what it means for basic legal safeguards.
Go on.
Well, take those inquiries, the inquirios, like the fake news inquiry or the anti-democratic acts one we mentioned.
Yeah.
Our sources describe them as having no formal end date. They just continue. Indefinitely.
But forever investigations.
Pretty much. They hang over people, over organizations, like this perpetual sword of Damocles, creating this constant state of legal limbo, uncertainty, fear. You never know when the next decision might drop.
That sounds incredibly stressful and intimidating.
It does. But maybe even more concerning, and something that seems like a direct affront to basic principles of justice. It's the scenario painted by the sources, where the same judges are allegedly responsible for initiating the investigation, overseeing the gathering of evidence, making accusations, and then ultimately judging the case.
Wait, the investigator, the accuser, and the judge are all the same person, or the same institution.
That's the situation described. Imagine if a detective investigating a crime was also the prosecutor bringing the charges and the judge presiding over the trial.
That sounds like a massive conflict of interest, fundamentally unfair.
Exactly. This blurring of lines, this collapse of roles, investigator, prosecutor, judge, into a single entity, it fundamentally challenges that core principle of judicial impartiality.
How can you get a fair hearing?
It raises serious questions about that. About the fairness of the proceedings, the ability to get an unbiased hearing. It really undermines the whole concept of the rule of law, according to these sources.
Okay, so if the picture being painted internally widespread censorship, justified as fighting disinformation, lack of due process, concentration of judicial power, what's the rest of the world saying? Is Brazil getting isolated over this? What's the international reaction?
That's a really important question. And the answer seems to be mixed and perhaps revealing.
How so?
Well, on one hand, our sources tell us that international NGOs, the big human rights groups, they have been sounding the alarm. It hasn't gone completely unnoticed.
Which group?
They specifically mention Human Rights Watch, a major global player, very respected, and also Article 19, which is an organization specifically focused on defending freedom of expression worldwide.
Okay, so heavyweight organizations. And what are they saying?
They haven't just issued, like, quiet warnings. They've publicly and repeatedly denounced what they see as severe threats to press freedom and to due process in Brazil.
So they're calling it out directly.
Yes. And that's significant. When these kinds of global watchdogs speak up, it usually means there's a serious issue that warrants international attention. Their reports often influence governments, diplomats, policymakers in other countries.
So the alarm bells are ringing in some quarters.
They are. And our sources also point to some reactions from within the United States government, or at least parts of it.
Like what?
They note that a group of Republican senators, including some quite prominent ones who focus on human rights and rule of law issues, they have specifically cited the Brazilian situation as a clear example of judicial censorship. They're using it as a case study, essentially.
Interesting. So it's being noticed in some influential political circles outside Brazil.
It suggests the issue isn't completely invisible on the international stage. At least some segments of the global political landscape are watching these developments with growing concern. And that could potentially lead to more formal responses down the line, maybe diplomatic pressure.
Okay, but you said the reaction was mixed. So there are NGOs, some U.S. senators, but then what?
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. and honestly, quite puzzling, according to our sources.
Hold on.
Despite these alarms from human rights groups, despite some politicians pointing fingers, our sources highlight something surprising and maybe deeply concerning.
What's that?
The mainstream international media. The big news outlets, the ones that shape global awareness.
Yeah. What about them?
They've given little to no prominence to this issue. Very little coverage.
Really? Despite the seriousness of the allegations, widespread censorship, judicial overreach, democratic principles eroding in a major country like Brazil.
Exactly. There seems to be this distinct, persistent lack of widespread, in-depth reporting on it in major international news sources.
Why would that be?
Our sources emphasize that, based on their analysis, this major international media often just completely ignores the scenario of selective repression unfolding in Brazil. Or, if they mention it, it's maybe a brief, superficial note, not the deep dive it seems to warrant.
That creates a kind of information vacuum, doesn't it?
It really does. And this raises that profoundly important and puzzling question. Why? Why is there such a stark difference between the urgent warnings from the human rights community and this relative silence or minimal coverage from major international news outlets?
Do the sources offer any explanation?
They don't give one single definitive answer, but you can sort of read between the lines or infer potential reasons. Maybe it's the complexity of Brazil's legal system, its politics. It's complicated to explain easily in a news report.
Could be. Or maybe other world crises are just grabbing the headlines.
That's certainly possible. Attention spans are limited, resources are limited, but the sources also hint at other possibilities.
Such as?
Well, perhaps some media outlets are reluctant to challenge that official narrative we talked about, we're just combating disinformation line. Maybe it sounds plausible enough or fits certain preconceptions.
Or maybe political alignment. Could it be that some international media are perhaps more sympathetic to the current Brazilian administration, and so they tend to overlook or downplay repression that seems targeted more at right-leaning figures?
That's certainly an interpretation suggested by the framing in some of the source material, yes, that there might be a political lens affecting the coverage, leading to a blind spot for this specific type of alleged repression.
Regardless of the reason, the lack of global visibility is a problem.
A huge problem, because international pressure, global awareness, these are often really key factors in pushing back against human rights abuses or democratic backsliding. If the world isn't watching, or isn't being told the full story,
then these things can develop much more easily without scrutiny or accountability.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It allows these issues to potentially fester in the shadows.
Okay, so if this is what's happening, if the picture painted by our sources is broadly accurate,
right,
what's ultimately at stake here? What are the bigger implications?
Our sources frame this situation in quite stark terms. They suggest it could be laying the groundwork for what they call a new form of digital authoritarianism.
Digital authoritarianism. What does that mean exactly?
It highlights how modern technology, things like social media platforms, algorithms, digital banking, online identity stuff, we often thought of initially as tools for freedom and connection.
Yeah, the early promise of the internet.
Right. How those very tools can be turned around, leveraged by the state for really pervasive control. It's not the old model of authoritarianism, necessarily.
Not tanks in the streets, like you said.
Or secret police knocking on doors in the middle of the night, although arrests still happen. But it's also about controlling the digital space. Your online profile, your ability to transact financially online, your access to information, your ability to speak.
It sounds more subtle, but maybe just as effective, or even more so.
That's the argument. It's an evolution of control, deeply impactful in our connected world.
And what's fascinating here, and profoundly unsettling, is seeing how these control mechanisms have evolved.
Yeah.
It really is more than just traditional censorship, like, shutting down a printing press.
Oh, much more. It's an evolution in how state power can be applied in the digital age. And it hits people right where they live, work, and connect today.
So what are the specific consequences for someone who dissents, according to these sources?
They are far-reaching and really severe. First, there's the complete loss of digital platforms we talked about.
Getting deplatformed.
Yes, but often by judicial order, not just a platform's decision, which means your digital presence can be effectively erased, your voice silenced, your livelihood, if it depends on that platform, destroyed, your ability to participate in public life, gone. Often, your entire professional network disappears overnight.
devastating in today's world.
Absolutely. But it often goes beyond just being kicked off social media. Our sources detail severe financial restrictions.
Like the frozen bank accounts you mentioned?
Exactly. Frozen assets, blocked bank accounts. Imagine not being able to access your own money. Pay your rent, buy food, support your family, run your business.
Just because of something you said or wrote online?
That's the chilling reality depicted in the sources. It creates this immense, almost existential pressure to just shut up and conform.
And it gets even worse, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned prior censorship.
Yes. That's another deeply concerning tactic highlighted. The idea that content can be blocked or suppressed before it's even published or broadcast.
How does that even work?
It could be a court order telling a platform not to allow certain topics, or telling a media outlet not to run a specific story. It's not about removing illegal content after the fact, through due process. It's about preventing speech from ever entering the public square in the first place.
Which creates a massive chilling effect. People start censoring themselves out of fear.
Precisely. Self-censorship becomes rampant. And then, perhaps the most fundamental issue, which keeps coming up.
The lack of defense.
Yes. The sources reiterate this pervasive problem of individuals facing judicial persecution, sometimes very serious charges, without the right to a proper defense. Often, they claim, people don't even know the specific accusations against them in these sealed inquiries. They can't see the evidence. They can't confront their accusers.
Which just completely undermines the most basic legal rights you'd expect in a democracy governed by the rule of law.
Fundamentally. So, taking all this together, what does it mean for Brazil's place in the world, for other countries watching? Brazil is, after all, a major regional power, often seen as a democratic anchor in South America.
Yeah, what are the global repercussions?
Well, it leads to this profound and, frankly, dangerous paradox. Brazil presents itself to the world and is often perceived as this vibrant democracy.
Right, carnival, football, elections.
Exactly. But then, according to these sources, behind that facade, it's acting in ways that look much more like a state that criminalizes dissent and systematically punishes opinions it doesn't like.
That tension, that contradiction, it must be noticed internationally.
What's fascinating and deeply concerning is exactly that tension between the nation's stated democratic identity and the practical realities being observed or alleged within its borders. And yes, astute international observers do notice this contradiction. And it has real consequences.
Like what?
Well, for starters, it inevitably weakens international confidence in Brazil. Confidence not just in its political stability, but in its fundamental commitment to human rights and the rule of law.
And that lack of confidence matters.
Oh, absolutely. It can lead to very tangible economic consequences.
Yeah.
Think about foreign investment. Businesses, investors, they look for stability, predictability, legal security.
They don't want to invest somewhere where the rules seem arbitrary or politically motivated.
Exactly. When the rule of law appears compromised, when contracts might not be honored, when assets could be frozen on a whim, it deters capital. It can lead to a flight of investment, hurting the economy.
Okay, so economic impacts. But beyond money.
Beyond the immediate economic hit, the ultimate consequence, the one our sources really emphasize, is the severe erosion of the rule of law itself.
And why is that so critical?
Because the rule of law isn't just some abstract legal concept. It's the foundation, the bedrock of any stable, functioning democracy. It's what guarantees predictability, fairness, accountability. It's what protects citizens from arbitrary power.
And it's key for international relations, too.
Absolutely. When the rule of law in a country is perceived to be weakening, when courts seem political, when due process is ignored, when basic rights like free speech are trampled, it undermines trust globally.
Makes the country seem unreliable.
Unreliable, unpredictable. It sends a signal that fundamental principles aren't being respected. And that has long-lasting damage to a nation's reputation, its diplomatic relationships, its ability to be a trusted partner on the world stage. It affects everything.
So let's try to wrap this up. To recap the core challenge here. Brazilian democracy, based on what our sources are describing, it's undergoing this really profound test right now.
A significant test, yes.
But it's crucial to understand, right? This isn't the kind of test we usually think about with democracies. It's not about whether elections are happening or votes are being counted accurately.
No, the electoral mechanics might seem fine on the surface.
It's a deeper test, a fundamental test of its core principles, especially, it seems, that vital principle of freedom of expression.
That pillar seems to be under the most strain.
Yeah. Our sources really underscored that this pillar, absolutely essential for any real democratic order, is presented as being significantly cracked in Brazil. maybe even crumbling.
It suggests the whole framework, the foundational pillars of its democracy, are under severe pressure, threatening to really reshape the country's political future in ways we haven't seen before.
And this is exactly why getting this story out, why understanding it beyond Brazil's own borders is so critical.
International awareness matters.
The message from our sources feels clear and pretty urgent. When censorship stops being just an isolated incident, an unfortunate mistake or exception.
And instead becomes, or appears to become, a systematic, state-backed policy.
Then the rest of the world really has a responsibility to pay attention, to understand what's truly going on, and to reckon with it.
It's not just Brazil's internal business at that point.
No. It has huge implications for how all democracies define themselves, how they protect their citizens' rights, and ultimately, whether they can survive these kinds of insidious pressures that try to undermine them from within.
So this deep dive, hopefully, has served as both, an invitation for you, the listener, to reflect, but also undoubtedly as a stark alert based on the information we've reviewed.
Yeah.
The situation in Brazil, as depicted in these comprehensive sources we've explored, it really leaves us with a powerful and deeply thought-provoking statement to chew on, something to consider long after you stop listening.
What's that?
It's a stark reminder, one that echoes through history but feels incredibly relevant in our digital age. The democracy dies, often, in silence.
In silence.
Or in the name of democracy.
Wow. Using the word itself to justify its destruction.
Exactly. It encourages all of us, I think, to reflect on that profound idea, its chilling implications, not just for Brazil, but for democracies everywhere, especially when that very word, democracy, is invoked to justify actions that seem to fundamentally attack the freedoms it's supposed to guarantee.